With a flick of his tail, he turned away, leaving me rooted to the spot, the shame and exhaustion settling even heavier on my shoulders. Slowly, I pushed myself back to my paws and turned toward the next task, the weight of Winter's words dragging behind me like a shadow. Exhaustion clung to me like a heavy cloak as I finished the last of my chores. My paws dragged with every step as I made my way to Winter, who stood waiting in a small clearing. He was surrounded by the youngest pups, their bright eyes locked on him as he guided them through simple lessons. Even among them, his presence was commanding, his voice sharp but steady as he gave instructions. I lowered myself into a bow the moment he approached, pressing my chest close to the ground. My ears flattened as I glanced up at him with pleading eyes, bracing myself for the anger, the contempt I had come to expect from him. But none of it came. Winter's gaze was cold, detached, as if he were staring past me rather than at me. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried no emotion, only the weight of a command.
"Get ready for practice,"
he said curtly, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and rose to my paws. His dispassion somehow felt heavier than his scorn, but I nodded and waited for further instructions.
"We'll continue where we left off earlier,"
Winter announced, his sharp eyes watching me closely.
"Scent training, mixed with tracking. You will pick up where the pups leave off."
I blinked in surprise, glancing at the younger wolves who were busy sniffing around a series of scattered objects Winter had placed for them. They moved clumsily, their enthusiasm outweighing their skill. I knew this was basic training, something even I had done long ago, yet it felt like an intentional reminder of my place. Winter stepped closer, his presence looming as he spoke.
"This time, you will work alone. The pups are ahead of you in rank, and you should take this as a chance to prove you can at least match their progress."
I dipped my head, keeping my voice steady as I replied,
"Understood."
Winter flicked his tail sharply.
"Begin,"
he commanded, his tone clipped and unyielding. I moved toward the area he had indicated, my nose lowering to the ground as I tried to block out everything but the task at hand. The scents were faint, scattered among the dirt and leaves, but I focused, determined to follow them as precisely as I could. Every step felt heavier than it should, my exhaustion clawing at the edges of my concentration, but I pressed on, knowing failure wasn't an option. Behind me, I could feel Winter's cold gaze watching my every move, waiting for even the smallest mistake. I lowered my nose to the ground, focusing on the faint trails of scent that Winter had set out. His cold gaze burned into my back as I moved carefully, every step deliberate. I could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on me, but I kept my focus, determined not to falter. The pups were scattered nearby, their small bodies bounding clumsily through their own practice. Their enthusiasm was almost infectious, their excitement over even the smallest success bringing wagging tails and soft yips of joy. One tripped over a twig, tumbling into another, and both broke into playful growls before Winter's sharp bark snapped them back to attention. They were cute, undeniably so, and their innocence brought a flicker of warmth to the otherwise cold clearing. But for me, there was no room for playfulness. I felt utterly ridiculous, my nose pressed to the dirt as if I were back in the earliest days of my training. Every misstep, every pause felt magnified under Winter's watchful eyes. Worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The subtle rustle of leaves, the faint murmur of voices just out of earshot. It was as if a few other wolves had gathered to watch me stumble through this basic exercise. I wanted to glance up to see if my suspicions were true, but I forced myself to keep my head down. This was my task, and no matter how degrading it felt, I had to complete it. If I could do this without error, maybe, just maybe, I could prove that this was at least easy for me. My paws moved steadily, each step deliberate as I followed the trail. The scent grew faint at points, lost among the overwhelming earthiness of the forest floor, but I kept going. My heart pounded in my chest, not from exertion, but from the pressure to succeed under Winter's unyielding scrutiny. The pups giggled behind me, their antics a stark contrast to the seriousness of my situation, but I blocked them out, focusing on the only thing that mattered: finishing this task perfectly. As I neared the end of my training, Winter remained nearby, his cold, watchful gaze following my every move. The exhaustion clawed at me, but I forced myself to stay focused. Every step mattered under his scrutiny, especially now. I was so close to finishing. Before I could complete my final task, I noticed Wolfgang approaching Winter from the corner of my eye. My stomach tightened as I tried to focus on the work before me. Wolfgang's presence was impossible to ignore, his sharp movements and commanding demeanor drawing attention without effort. Winter straightened the moment Wolfgang arrived. Their low voices exchanged words that felt heavier than usual. Though I couldn't hear most of their conversation, a phrase reached my ears, spoken in Wolfgang's unmistakably firm tone.
Her new den is ready. It's located where I scolded her before. Make sure she knows.
Winter's ear flicked, but he said nothing in response, nodding once in acknowledgement. Wolfgang turned and walked away without even glancing in my direction, his steps firm and deliberate. I focused intently on my task, finishing it as efficiently as I could despite the knot in my stomach. When I was done, I stepped back and waited, keeping my head lowered as Winter approached.
You're dismissed,
He said curtly, his tone icy and devoid of emotion. Relief washed over me momentarily, and I started to turn back toward the den. But Winter's voice stopped me, as sharp as a bite.
One more thing.
He said, his gaze cold and unyielding. Your sleeping arrangements have been changed. I turned back to face him slowly, dread pooling in my chest.
Changed?
I whispered, my voice barely audible.
Yes,
Winter said bluntly, his tone as cutting as ever.
you will no longer sleep in the den with the others. Wolfgang has arranged a separate den for you.
He paused, letting the words sink in before adding,
It's near the clearing where he scolded you.
My heart dropped. That place, it was already a source of humiliation, a reminder of how low I had fallen. Now, it would be where I slept.
Separate den.
I stammered, my voice shaking. Winter's expression didn't soften in the slightest.
You heard me.
He said, his words clipped.
Consider this part of earning back your place. Now go.
I nodded weakly, lowering my head in submission. Without another word, I turned and began the walk toward the clearing. Each step felt heavier than the last as I moved toward the place that had already become a scar in my memory. When I arrived, the small den was waiting, a hollow carved into the earth, simple and isolated. The clearing around it was empty, the air thick with the weight of past scoldings and my current humiliation. I stepped inside, the shadows swallowing me, and curled up on the cold dirt floor. This was my new home, and I couldn't escape the feeling that it was Wolfgang's way of ensuring I'd never forget where I stood in the pack. As I curled up in the isolated den, the silence felt heavy and suffocating. Shadows stretched across the dirt walls, but they weren't as dark as the weight of my own thoughts. Every mistake, every harsh word from Winter, every sharp glance from Wolfgang replayed in my mind like a bad howl echoing through the night. Winter's cold disdain had been unrelenting all day, his barked commands slicing through me like icy wind. But as my thoughts wandered, they shifted to Wolfgang. He wasn't my mentor anymore, but his resentment still burned as fiercely as ever. He'd once been the wolf tasked with guiding me, shaping me, and I'd failed him in ways I couldn't even count. His gaze, whenever it fell on me, felt like a clawed reminder of everything I'd cost him. And the pack. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the memory of that day. The day when everything changed. I could see it so clearly. The younger version of myself, standing there thinking I could help. I had some skills then, ones Wolfgang had drilled into me as his apprentice, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd been given an order. Go get help.
And what did I do? Protest, hesitate, defy? Oh, Wolfdom, why didn't I just listen?
I buried my head into the dirt, a low whimper escaping my throat. If I'd just done as I was told, maybe things would be different. Maybe I wouldn't be here now, humiliated and stripped of all dignity. Maybe Wolfgang wouldn't look at me like I'm the very thing dragging this pack down. Rolling over in frustration, I huffed out a breath. Winter was my mentor now, and while his cold, methodical teaching cut deep, it wasn't the same as Wolfgang's raw anger. Winter didn't hate me. Not like Wolfgang did. For Winter, this was duty. For Wolfgang, this was personal. Every snide remark, every dismissive glare, it all felt like a reminder that I'd once been his responsibility, and that I'd failed him in every way that mattered. But what made it worse was Cloud. If he hadn't stood up for me, maybe Wolfgang wouldn't have made my punishment so public. His defiance had forced Wolfgang to humiliate me in front of the entire pack, ensuring that no wolf would forget my failure. I rolled back onto my side, staring blankly at the dirt wall of the den. The shadows felt like they were closing in, unrelenting.
I can't leave the camp, not with no name. No wolf would take me seriously, and Wolfgang knows that. That's why he doesn't need to exile me. He can make things so much worse, just like he's done with these sleeping arrangements. This den, this place, near where he scolded me. It's a constant reminder of how little I matter to the pack.
My tail curled tightly around me as I buried my face into my paws.
It's my fault, all of it.
My mind replayed Wolfgang's sharp words from that day, his unrelenting expectations still haunting me.
Don't break the rules. Don't disappoint me.
But what had I done? Hesitated, protested. I defied Winter, and now, no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much Winter drilled into me, it felt like I'd never crawl out of this hole. I'll do better.
I whispered into the silence, my voice trembling.
I have to.
But even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. Curling up tighter, I closed my eyes and tried to block out the day, willing sleep to come. But even as I began to drift off, Wolfgang's disdain, Winter's coldness, and Cloud's intervention lingered at the edges of my restless dreams, gnawing at me like shadows I couldn't escape. The dreams swallowed me whole, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Barked orders echoed relentlessly from the shadows, their harsh tones striking me like blows. I couldn't tell who was shouting or where the voices came from, only that they were everywhere, surrounding me. Thunder roared violently, its deafening rumble shaking the ground beneath me. Desperately, I looked for anything. A gleaming light, a glimmer of hope, something to guide me. But there was nothing. Nothing but the endless void. Panic gripped me as I did the only thing I could. I ran. My paws pounded against the unseen ground as I raced through the blackness, crashing into unseen trees, tripping over jagged stones. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, the voices followed, their commands growing louder, sharper, more relentless. I blinked awake, heart racing and breath ragged. The panic clung to me like a second skin as my eyes darted around, struggling to adjust to the dim light. I spun in place, trying to reorient myself, until the memories came rushing back. Right. I wasn't in the den with the pups anymore. I wasn't surrounded by warmth or the gentle sounds of sleeping wolves. I was here, in the coldest part of the camp. The place where pups were scolded harshly for breaking rules. Except now, no pup dared to break any rules. Not since I had shown them what it meant to fail. To be reduced to this. I huffed out a bitter breath and sat down.
Yeah, great role model.
I thought sarcastically.
A perfect example of what not to do if you want to avoid ending up like me.
The night was still thick, the sky untouched by the first rays of dawn. I sat there, unsure of what to do. Pups weren't allowed to leave their dens without permission, and I'd never been the kind to test those rules. At least, not anymore. Normally, I'd let the wolf in charge of the nursery den know if I needed to step out. But here, there was no such wolf to ask. I stood up, pacing back and forth near the den's entrance. The cold bit at my fur as I debated whether stepping out would count as breaking the rules. Surely not, I thought. But then again, Wolfgang had a way of twisting everything.
What if leaving without permission is exactly the kind of thing he's waiting for me to do?
I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but before I could decide, a sharp bark cut through the still air.
Get out here now!
Winter's voice was unmistakable, his tone filled with icy anger. I froze, my paws glued to the ground as his words echoed in my ears. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat heavier than the last. He didn't sound happy, not even close. It took every ounce of courage I had to take a single step forward. My legs trembled as I forced myself to move, inching toward the entrance of the den. When I stepped outside, the chill of the early morning hit me, but it was nothing compared to the cold glare that awaited me. Winter stood there, his eyes sharp and unyielding, his posture rigid with barely restrained frustration. His presence was overwhelming, and I could already feel his scolding brewing, ready to strike like a storm. I lowered my head instinctively, my paws shifting nervously beneath me. Whatever I had done, or not done, I knew it wouldn't matter. Winter was upset, and I was about to face the full force of his ire. Winter's gaze bore into me, sharp and unyielding, but his tone was flat, devoid of anger or irritation.
Good. Time for your chores.
He said simply.
When you're done, we'll move on to more training.
I lowered my head, bowing slightly before turning away to begin my tasks. I braced myself for his usual coldness, expecting scolding or berating for no reason, but none came. His voice had been so even, so detached, that it unsettled me even more than his anger usually did. I started my chores, focusing on completing them quickly and as thoroughly as possible. But Winter wasn't content to let me work in peace. He followed close behind, his sharp eyes catching every mistake I made, his voice cutting through the silence with harsh corrections.
Number not like that.
He said coldly as I tried to adjust a bundle of bedding.
This is how it's done.
His words felt like jabs, each one setting me back. I fixed the bedding, trying to mimic his precise instructions, only to hear him again.
Still wrong. Start over.
Every comment stung, each criticism dragging me further down into a pit of shame. No matter how hard I tried, it seemed I couldn't get it right. Redoing the same tasks over and over, trying to meet his impossible standards, felt like an endless cycle. My paws ached, my chest tightened with frustration, and my thoughts swirled with regret. If only I could go back, I thought bitterly, my claws digging into the dirt as I adjusted another task for the third time. If only I could fix my mistake, I wouldn't be here now. I wouldn't be reduced to this. Relearning things I already know. But no matter how much I wished it, the past wasn't something I could change. My mistake, my failure was carved into the pack's history, and I was stuck here, dragging its weight behind me. Winter's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts again.
Do it right this time.
He said sharply, his tone as cold as the early morning air. I shook my head slightly, trying to clear the regret clouding my focus.
I can't go back, I reminded myself. I can only keep moving forward.
With a deep breath, I forced myself to push through the tasks, even as I struggled to meet Winter's exacting standards. The constant corrections weighed on me, each one a reminder of how far I had fallen. But I kept going, trying to do my best, even if it meant redoing everything over and over again. Winter's sharp voice followed me through every step of the morning, his corrections relentless and cutting. My paws ached, my chest felt heavy, and with every task I tried to complete, his icy tone chipped away at whatever resolve I still had left.
No!
He snapped, his voice like a whip.
You don't just do the task, you do it right. Again.
I clenched my jaw, biting back the words I wanted to say. There was no room for argument, no hope of any leniency. His words were deliberate and harsh, like a parent trying to drill discipline into an unruly pup, but without a shred of encouragement, only disappointment. I moved to fix the bedding again, adjusting it exactly the way he had shown me earlier. My body trembled with the weight of his constant criticisms, the pressure building with every second that I couldn't meet his impossible standards. My paws fumbled once, and his sharp bark cut through the air.
Pay attention. You're not a pup just learning this. Or have you already forgotten why you're here?
His words hit like blows, each one heavier than the last. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the ground, to escape the shame that clung to me like a second skin. Finally, after what felt like hours, I managed to complete every task the way Winter demanded. My body sagged with exhaustion, and for a fleeting moment, I let myself feel a hint of relief. But it was short-lived. Winter's sharp bark shattered the silence.
Let's get going. That only took half the day and put us behind for your training.
I flinched but didn't dare respond. My tail hung low as I followed him, my head bowed in defeat. As we walked toward the little clearing in camp, I felt the weight of my punishment settle over me again.
3 days. 3 days stuck in camp, restricted to this isolated corner, for my blatant disregard of Winter's orders that day.
The memory burned like fresh wounds, and the embarrassment of it made my ears flatten further against my head. When we reached the clearing, Winter's voice carried across the space, commanding and sharp.
Training today is for listening.
He barked, his tone deliberate.
You will be given commands to follow, and you will follow them.
I swallowed hard, my body tensing as I prepared myself for what was to come. The training was straightforward but grueling. Winter's commands were precise, his tone cold and unwavering, every word sharp enough to leave a mark.
Move faster. You're too slow.
He barked when my timing slipped.
Stay focused. Do you even understand what I said?
His sharp criticisms followed every mistake I made, forcing me to fix and repeat the tasks over and over until I got them right. My paws ached with every misstep, my muscles screaming as I pushed through the endless cycle of correction and repetition. The clearing wasn't entirely empty, and the weight of the onlookers' gazes made every mistake feel heavier. Wolves passing by glanced at me with varying degrees of pity, disdain, or amusement. Some of the younger pups even stopped to watch, their curious eyes wide as they whispered and giggled amongst themselves.
Is that what we're supposed to do?
One pup asked, his voice loud enough for me to hear.
She keeps messing up.
Another pup laughed, and my ears burned with humiliation. I wanted to snap at them, to tell them to stop, but Winter's voice cut through the chatter before I could even lift my head.
Enough,
He said, his tone smooth and measured as he addressed the pups.
You're here to learn. Watch closely. This is what happens when you don't follow orders.
His voice lacked the harshness he reserved for me, softened slightly for the young ones.
You will do better because you will listen.
The pups quieted, their attention shifting back to Winter, their giggles replaced with awe and respect. I, however, felt like I was breaking under the weight of it all. Winter's relentless orders, the pup's judgment, the ache in my paws and legs. But I couldn't stop. Not unless I wanted more humiliation, more disdain. So I pushed forward, my body trembling with exhaustion and shame, determined to keep going even as my spirit cracked beneath the weight of it all. Once every task in the grueling training session was completed, my body felt like it was about to collapse. My paws ached, my legs trembled, and the weight of Winter's sharp commands still hung over me like a storm cloud. But just as I thought there might be a moment to catch my breath, Winter barked out new orders.
Now,
He snapped, his voice as cutting as ever.
you'll assist the wolf doctors and nurses. Get moving.
I nodded weakly and followed him to the den used by the healers. My mind raced, wondering what tasks I'd be assigned.
Would it be something meaningful? Something to show I could contribute? Of course not. Winter made sure of that.
Your job is to clean and clear their den.
He said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument.
Keep out of their way. This is no place for your mistakes.
The words stung, but I kept my head low, suppressing the urge to snap back. I set to work, clearing old bedding, organizing supplies, and sweeping dirt and debris out of the den. Every task was simple, meaningless. But still, Winter watched me like a hawk, his criticisms harsher than before.
Do it properly.
He barked when I moved too slowly.
You call that clean? Start again.
His voice was sharper now, colder, each word cutting into me as I tried to keep up with his relentless standards. I fumbled once, my exhaustion showing in the way I nearly dropped a stack of dried herbs. Winter's growl was immediate, his words biting.
This is not a place for your mistakes. If you continue like this, I'll confine you to your den for the rest of the day.
His threat sent a wave of mixed emotions crashing over me. Part of me felt crushed at the thought of being confined to my den, humiliated yet again. But another part of me, one I hated to admit, almost considered it a reprieve. At least then I wouldn't have to endure his relentless scrutiny, his constant criticism. But I knew better. If Winter sent me to my den, the punishment would only be worse tomorrow. Wolfgang would make sure of it. Swallowing my frustration, I nodded and forced myself to focus. Just get through this, I thought bitterly, my paws trembling as I carefully moved the next stack of supplies. Don't mess up again. I worked with grim determination, pushing my aching body to its limits. Even if I had to repeat a task 3 or 4 times to meet Winter's impossible standards, I would do it. Anything to avoid the sharp edge of his anger, and the humiliation of being confined to my den like a disobedient pup. As I continued, the wolf doctors and nurses moved around me, their whispers just loud enough to reach my ears. I could feel their judgment, their quiet disdain, but I ignored it. My focus was on each task, each moment, trying to get through without slipping up. Even though every bone in my body screamed for rest, I pushed forward, determined not to fail again. No matter how small or meaningless the job, I had to finish it perfectly. Anything less wasn't an option. Finally, Winter's cold, icy voice cut through the den, sharp and unyielding.
You finally did things right.
He said, his tone as emotionless as ever.
Good. Now to your den. Rest until I come fetch you.
For a moment, I almost felt surprised, a flicker of disbelief creeping through my exhaustion. After all the mistakes, the endless corrections, and his relentless criticisms, I hadn't expected him to let me go without another scolding. But just as quickly, the moment passed. His words held no warmth, no hint of approval, just a command. And the weight of
I'll come fetch you
lingered ominously in the air. I nodded silently and turned toward my den, my legs dragging beneath me. As I passed through the camp, I caught sight of Cloud in the far distance, walking beside his mentor. His bright, eager expression stood out even from afar, his tail high and wagging with pride. They must have returned from training, and Cloud looked as though he had conquered the world. He didn't even glance in my direction. The pit in my stomach grew, a heavy, sinking feeling that twisted with every step. Of course, he wouldn't look this way, I thought bitterly.
Why would he?
His pride, his joy only deepened my own sense of failure. By the time I reached my den, I was utterly drained, not just from the endless tasks, the relentless orders, or Winter's icy tone, but from the cold, crushing weight of it all. The disappointment sat heavy on my shoulders, dragging me down. I collapsed onto the sparse bedding, the ache in my body paling in comparison to the ache inside me. It wasn't the physical pain that hurt the most. It was everything else. The shame, the humiliation, the overwhelming sense of inadequacy. I buried my face into the bedding, letting out a slow, shaky breath.
Just keep going, I told myself.
Though the words felt hollow,